In the violent chaos of America's frontier, where law was scarce and survival was everything, two men rose to infamy unlike any others. They weren't soldiers fighting for a cause, nor outlaws seeking fortune. They were something darker. Micajah and Wiley Harp, better known as Big Harp and Little Harp, terrorized the wilderness of Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s. They left behind no mercy, no justice, only fear. More than 30 innocent men, women, and even children would meet their deaths at the hands of these brothers. Their story is chilling, brutal, and unforgettable, the blood-stained tale of America's first true serial killers. Before we dive deep into this terrifying history, I have a question for you. Do you think evil is born or made by the world around us? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if you love dark history and true crime, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the untold stories of America's past. The late 18th century was a time of transition for America. The Revolutionary War had ended, but peace was fragile. The frontier, especially Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley, was wild and unsettled. Native American tribes were resisting westward expansion, and settlers fought daily battles against hunger, raids, and lawlessness. In this violent world, brutality often replaced justice. It was the perfect breeding ground for men like the Harpe Brothers. But who were they? And why did they kill? Micajah Harp, known as Big Harp, was the larger and more dominant of the two. Wiley Harp, called Little Harp, was smaller, more cunning, and always at his brother's side. Together they became synonymous with cruelty. Historians believe the Harps were born in North Carolina in the 1760s. Their family background was poor, and from an early age the boys learned to rely on violence. During the American Revolution, instead of fighting for independence, they joined Tory raiders, loyalists to the British Crown. These raiders often committed atrocities against frontier families, burning homes, stealing livestock, and killing indiscriminately. It's said the Harps thrived in this environment. They developed a taste for blood and discovered that power came through fear. Unlike bandits who robbed for wealth, the Harps seemed driven by cruelty itself. Traveling across the frontier, the Harps were rarely alone. They abducted or coerced women to follow them, living in constant captivity. Big Harp had at least 2 wives and Little Harp 1. These women were often treated brutally, forced to endure their crimes, and dragged into their violent world. Some accounts suggest that the women were unwilling victims, desperate to escape, but trapped by fear. Others say they occasionally helped the brothers survive, cooking, cleaning, and raising their children in the shadows of bloodshed. By the early 1790s, the Harps had begun killing settlers. Unlike highwaymen who killed to avoid being caught, the Harps murdered for no clear reason. They butchered travelers, farmers, and even children. One story tells of Big Harp murdering a crying baby, his own child, because the infant S cries annoyed him. According to witnesses, he grabbed the child by its ankles and smashed its head against a tree. This shocking act revealed the true nature of the brothers. They killed not for survival, not for greed, but for pleasure and domination. Settlers soon began to whisper of 2 shadowy figures haunting the roads between Kentucky and Tennessee. Bodies were discovered in rivers, woods, and fields, often mutilated beyond recognition. The Harps killed more than 30 people, though the true number may be higher. Their victims were random: travelers on horseback, farmers plowing fields, even innkeepers. The randomness made them even more terrifying. No one knew when or where they would strike. The frontier community eventually organized posses to hunt them down. On several occasions, the Harps were captured. Yet, remarkably, they escaped time and again, aided by the wilderness and their own ruthlessness. One of the most infamous chases ended with Big Harp's death. In 1799, after murdering a man named Moses Stegall and his infant child, the Harps were pursued by local militia. Big Harp was shot, captured, and, before dying, confessed to killing at least 20 people himself. According to reports, his head was cut off and displayed on a pole at a crossroads as a grim warning to others. That place became known as Harp's Head in Kentucky folklore. After Big Harp's death, Little Harp continued his life of crime. He joined another outlaw, Samuel Mason, on the Mississippi River, robbing boats and travelers. Eventually, in a twist of fate, Little Harp betrayed Mason, killed him, and brought Mason's head to authorities in hopes of claiming a reward. But his past caught up with him. The law finally executed Little Harp in 1804. His body was left hanging as a warning to others, much like his brother's severed head years earlier. The Harpe brothers left behind a legacy drenched in blood. Unlike other criminals of their time, they weren't driven by politics, revenge, or even money. Their murders were acts of terror for the sake of terror. This is why many historians call them America's first true serial killers. Their story has been passed down for more than 2 centuries as a reminder of the darkness that can exist in human nature. On the frontier, where civilization was thin and justice scarce, the Harps thrived. They were predators in a land struggling to create order. Before I take you into the blood-soaked frontier where the Harpe brothers carved their name in history, I need to ask you something. If you lived in the 1790s with no police, no courts, and no safety, only wilderness and whispers of killers in the dark, would you fight? Or would you flee? Tell me in the comments right now. I want to know. Are you brave enough to face evil, or would you run to save your life? And if chilling history and true crime stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe this very moment. Because what you're about to hear is darker, more shocking, and more disturbing than anything Hollywood could ever imagine. The death of Big Harp in 1799 might have ended one nightmare, but it did not end the legend of the Harpe brothers. Evil rarely dies cleanly. Little Harp, the surviving brother, continued his descent into crime, betrayal, and bloodshed, leaving behind a legacy that still haunts America's history. Big Harp was captured, riddled with bullets, and executed by enraged settlers. His head was displayed on a pole at a crossroads in Kentucky. For years, travelers passed that spot and shuddered at the grisly sight. The road became known as Harp's Head, a permanent reminder of what terror looks like when men give themselves fully to cruelty. But the nightmare wasn't over. Little Harp, smaller, quieter, and perhaps even more calculating, escaped into the wilderness. Where his brother had been impulsive and brutal, Wiley Harp had always been more cautious, watching, waiting, planning. And now, without Big Harp overshadowing him, Wiley was free to continue the life of an outlaw. The Mississippi River in the early 1800s was a perfect hiding place for men like Wiley Harp. The frontier towns were thinly policed, and the river itself was a highway for traders, merchants, and families moving west. Bandits preyed on travelers, and among them was Samuel Mason, a notorious outlaw who commanded a gang along the river. Wiley Harp joined Mason's crew, hiding his identity at first. Among criminals, his reputation was both an advantage and a curse. He was feared, but he was also hunted. The law had not forgotten the Harps, and bounty hunters still roamed the frontier with his name on their lips. Mason's gang specialized in robbing flatboats, often killing their victims to leave no witnesses. For Wiley, this was familiar work. He blended into the gang, using the same methods he and Big Harp had once used: deception, sudden ambush, and merciless slaughter. Travelers spoke of men who vanished after setting out down the Mississippi. Boats were found drifting empty, stained with blood. Bodies floated downstream, stripped of valuables. Though Mason's name was most feared at that time, Wiley Harp's hand was in many of these crimes. The difference between Mason and Harp, however, was purpose. Mason robbed for wealth. Harp killed because he could. To Wiley, murder wasn't a tool, it was a thrill. By 1803, the frontier authorities had grown desperate to end Mason's reign. A bounty was placed on Samuel Mason's head, dead or alive. For Wiley Harp, the bounty offered both temptation and opportunity. He had lived long enough as a fugitive. Perhaps he thought he could buy his freedom with one final act of betrayal. In a shocking turn, Wiley Harp and another gang member murdered Mason himself. They cut off his head and carried it to authorities in an attempt to claim the reward. Imagine the scene. 2 ragged outlaws, grim and desperate, arriving with a bloody sack, presenting it as proof of Mason's death. But justice is not so easily tricked. Authorities quickly recognized Wiley Harp as who he truly was, the last surviving Harpe brother. Instead of reward, he received chains. Instead of freedom, he faced the gallows. In 1804, wily Harp was hanged for his crimes. His body was left dangling in public, a warning to anyone who might consider following his path. Just as Big Harp's head had been displayed, so too was Little Harp's death made into a grim spectacle. The frontier demanded brutal justice for brutal men. And with that, the bloodline of terror known as the Harpe Brothers finally came to its end. The story of the Harpe Brothers has endured for over 2 centuries, not simply because of the crimes themselves, but because of what they represent. They were not robbers who killed for money, nor warriors who killed for land or politics. They killed for cruelty's sake. Their victims were not chosen carefully or strategically. They were random, innocent, and often vulnerable. This randomness made their reign of terror feel unstoppable. Even today, criminologists and historians debate the Harps. Were they products of a violent frontier, shaped by the chaos of revolution and lawlessness? Or were they simply born with evil in their blood? The answer may never be known, but their story laid the foundation for what we now call the serial killer in America. Though many of their victims were silenced forever, a few survived encounters with the Harps, and their testimonies helped shape the legend. Travelers told stories of being approached on lonely roads by 2 rough men who offered food or shelter, only to turn violent without warning. Some described the brothers laughing during their killings as if human life meant nothing. The women who lived with them, wives or captives depending on the account, also provided chilling details after the brothers' deaths. They spoke of constant fear, of being forced to move camp after every murder, of burying bodies or helping clean stolen goods. Their stories painted the Harps not as wild beasts, but as cold, deliberate killers who planned their violence carefully. In the years after their deaths, the Harpe brothers became both folklore and cautionary tale. Parents warned their children about wandering too far into the woods, whispering that the Harps will get you. Settlers remembered them whenever another outlaw appeared, using their names as a benchmark for cruelty. But there is a deeper lesson in their story. The frontier was a place where civilization had not yet taken firm root. Lawmen were few, courts were distant, and survival often depended on neighbors banding together. The Harps thrived in that chaos because there was no strong system to stop them quickly. Their deaths, gruesome and public, were the community's way of reclaiming order. Violence was met with violence. The Harps were destroyed by the very frontier they had once terrorized. Today, historians often call Makaja and Wiley Harp America's first true serial killers. Their names are less famous than later figures like H.H. Holmes or Ted Bundy, but their crimes set a terrifying precedent. They showed that evil could thrive not only in cities but in the wilderness itself. More than 30 lives were lost to their hands, and countless others scarred by their brutality. Yet, perhaps the most haunting part of their story is the mystery of motivation. Why did they kill so mercilessly? Was it rage from a violent childhood? Hatred born during the Revolutionary War? Or something darker within their very souls? We may never know, but one thing is certain. The Harpe brothers remain a dark stain on America's past, a reminder of how fragile life was on the frontier, and how thin the line between man and monster can be. Before I take you deeper into the terrifying world of America's first serial killers, I need you to pause and think. Do you believe pure evil ever truly disappears? Or does it live on, waiting to return in another form? Comment your answer below. I'll be reading what you think. And if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of history, then hit subscribe right now. Trust me, what you're about to hear will shake you, because the Harpe brothers didn't just kill people. They left scars on America's very soul. When Little Harp's body swung lifeless from the gallows in 1804, the physical reign of terror was finally over. But the Harps were not erased. They lingered in whispers, in folklore, and in the fearful imaginations of settlers who had lived through their shadow. Evil men had come and gone before, but the Harpe brothers were different. They represented something that went beyond simple outlawry. They were the embodiment of cruelty for cruelty's sake. The frontier tried to move on. Settlements grew into towns, towns into cities, and states into nations. Yet whenever people gathered around fires at night, The stories returned. And always the Harps were at the center. Violent, merciless, unforgettable. For years after Big Harp's execution, his head remained on display along a Kentucky crossroads. It wasn't just a warning. It became a landmark. Travelers would say, "Meet me near Harp's head," using the grisly display as a point of direction. Children dared each other to get close. Some even swore they saw the skull smile at them beneath the moonlight. Folklore twisted reality into legend. People claimed that at night the ghost of Big Harp wandered the road searching for his missing body, calling out in rage. Others believed that the soil around the pole was cursed, that crops would not grow nearby, and that animals refused to graze there. Whether true or not, the image of a severed head guarding the highway kept the Harps alive in the imagination of frontier America. Lost in the brutality of the Harps' story are the women who were forced to travel with them. Some were kidnapped, some coerced, others too terrified to leave. After the brothers' deaths, fragments of their testimonies emerged. They spoke of hunger, fear, and nights when the brothers returned to camp soaked in blood, laughing as they described how a man had begged for mercy, or how a child had cried before its final breath. One of Big Harp's wives reportedly gave a chilling detail. The brothers did not see their victims as people, but as objects, things to destroy. This perspective explains why their killings were often senseless, why they targeted strangers without hesitation. To them, life had no meaning except as something to snuff out. These women, though freed after the Harps were gone, carried the scars forever. They lived with the weight of having been chained to monsters, of raising children in fear, and of being forced into silence. The question has never gone away. What drove the Harps to kill? Some historians argue they were products of their time. The American Revolution had shattered communities, and children like the Harps grew up surrounded by murder, raids, and chaos. Violence was not shocking, it was survival. Perhaps they simply internalized a world of cruelty until it became second nature. Others believe there was something darker, something innate. Their enjoyment of suffering, their laughter during murder, their willingness to kill their own children. All of these suggest not just brutality, but psychopathy. If that word had existed then, it would have been written across their names. The Harps are often called America's first serial killers, but they were also something primal. They were predators in human form. And like predators, they didn't stop until they were killed. The Harps forced early American communities to confront the question of justice. There were no strong courts, no police forces ready to act. Justice was often carried out by militias or by ordinary settlers banding together. Big Harp's death came not through trial, but through chase and execution. Little Harp's end came at the rope, after betrayal. These punishments were as brutal as the crimes. Severed heads on poles, bodies left hanging, warnings carved into wood. The frontier delivered justice in the same language the Harps had spoken: violence. And yet, it worked. The Harps' names became curses, their fates deterrents. For decades, their story served as proof that no matter how terrifying evil might be, the community would rise to crush it. Looking back, criminologists often draw parallels between the Harps and later infamous murderers. Unlike Jesse James or Billy the Kid, who at least had motives of wealth or rebellion, the Harps shared more in common with men like H. Holmes, Albert Fish, or Ted Bundy, killers driven not by necessity, but by a compulsion to inflict suffering. This comparison highlights why their story matters. They were not just outlaws. They were prototypes of a new, terrifying figure, the serial killer. A person whose crimes cannot be explained by need or gain, but only by desire. Over time, the Harps slipped into songs, ballads, and even theater. Folk singers warned of Big Harp and Little Harp, the devils of Kentucky. Plays portrayed them as almost supernatural villains. Writers used their names as shorthand for savagery. In some tales, they became larger than life, almost like demons. This transformation reveals something important. The frontier couldn't fully process what the Harps had been. To explain them, people turned them into legends. Legends are easier to remember than men and safer to repeat around campfires. The Harpe Brothers story is not just about murder. It is about what happens when order collapses, when society cannot protect its own. Their crimes were possible because America's frontier was lawless, because people were isolated, and because there was no system strong enough to stop them quickly. They remind us that civilization is fragile. Strip away courts, lawmen, and community, and monsters like the Harps emerge from the cracks. Their reign of terror is not just history, it is warning. Even today in Kentucky and Tennessee, their memory lingers. Roads, creeks, and valleys still carry the name Harp. Local legends say that if you stand in those places at night, you can hear cries on the wind or see shadows moving in the trees. Whether ghost stories or imagination, they prove one thing. The Harps are not forgotten. And maybe that's the true punishment. While their bodies rotted centuries ago, their names are still chained to infamy. Micajah and Wiley Harp will never be remembered as heroes, rebels, or folk champions. They will only ever be remembered as killers, the first serial killers of America. The Harpe brothers were not men who killed for greed. They were not soldiers defending land or cause. They were predators. They chose to take lives, dozens of them, for no reason other than cruelty. But their story is not only about horror, it is about survival. The frontier faced its darkest threat, and through determination and unity, the people overcame it. Evil rose, but evil was defeated. The Harps remind us that history is not just made by heroes. Sometimes it is shaped by villains, and sometimes the shadows of those villains stretch for centuries, warning us never to forget what humanity is capable of becoming when conscience is abandoned. Before I take you into the forgotten graves and the chilling silence left behind by the Harpe brothers, I have one question for you. If you were living on the American frontier in the 1790s, and two men like the Harps murdered your family, would you seek revenge with your own hands, or would you leave it to fate and God? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them all. And if you believe the past holds lessons about the darkness inside humanity, then hit subscribe now. Because what you about to hear is not just history, it is America's first true crime nightmare. The Harpe brothers are remembered because of their cruelty, but those they killed have been mostly forgotten. Most victims were ordinary people. Travelers on horseback, farmers moving west, women and children caught at the wrong place and the wrong time. Few of their names are recorded in history, but every one of them had families, hopes, and dreams that were ended in blood. One of the earliest known victims was a young settler traveling with his family along the wilderness road. He stopped for rest, never knowing that the Harps watched from the trees. His body was found days later, torn apart, his horse stolen. His wife and children survived only because neighbors helped them flee. Another victim was an innkeeper who offered the Harps food and shelter, showing kindness as was common on the frontier. He was rewarded with death. His body was left as a warning, his home ransacked. The Harps even turned on children. One of the most haunting stories is the murder of Big Harpe's own infant child, killed because its cries irritated him. That single act, perhaps more than any other, revealed the true nature of the brothers. To them, life was not sacred, not even their own blood. As word spread of random killings, panic gripped frontier communities. People became suspicious of strangers. Every traveler was eyed with doubt. Women refused to walk alone. Families armed themselves even when tending fields. Fear of the Harps turned the wilderness into a haunted landscape. The lack of law made matters worse. There were no patrols, no sheriffs with the power to protect the roads. Settlers had only themselves and their neighbors. Communities organized watches and hunting parties, but the Harps were cunning. They moved constantly, leaving little trace, appearing in one place one week and another the next. This mobility made them even more terrifying. They were not tied to one town or one region. They were ghosts of the wilderness, striking without pattern. Historians still wrestle with the question why. Unlike robbers, they rarely gained wealth. Unlike raiders, they weren't fighting for a cause. Some speculate they were driven by rage left over from their Tory days during the Revolutionary War, when violence against rebels became a way of life. Others argue they simply enjoyed killing. The evidence suggests this may be true. Many victims were left where they fell, possessions untouched. The Harps often boasted of their crimes, laughing about how a man begged for his life or how a family screamed. In one chilling account, they murdered a man named Moses Stiegel. When his wife cried out, Big Harp murdered her infant child by smashing it against a tree. The brutality was beyond reason. It was cruelty for its own sake. The Harps were captured more than once. In 1797, they were arrested in Kentucky, accused of horse theft and suspected of murder. But the frontier justice system was weak. They escaped jail before trial. Each time they slipped away, more bodies appeared. Settlers began to believe they were unstoppable, perhaps even protected by the devil. Their names carried the weight of myth. Finally, in 1799, the community rose in vengeance after the Stiegel murders. A posse hunted Big Harp relentlessly. They cornered him, shot him, and before he died, he reportedly confessed to killing more than 20 people with his own hands. His severed head became the infamous landmark, Harp's Head. While Big Harp's reign ended, Little Harp survived. He blended into outlaw gangs, particularly with Samuel Mason along the Mississippi River. Here, he returned to the familiar rhythm of robbery and murder, but his fate was sealed when he betrayed Mason himself, killing him and presenting his severed head to authorities for reward. Instead of freedom, he was recognized, captured, and executed in 1804. His hanging was public, his body left exposed, another warning to anyone tempted to follow his path. What cannot be counted is the ripple effect of the Harps' violence. Families abandoned settlements in fear, roads were deserted, trade slowed. Communities that were fragile to begin with nearly collapsed under the pressure of terror. The Harps were not just killers of individuals, they were killers of trust. They poisoned the very idea of hospitality, making neighbors fear strangers. They turned the wilderness into a place of dread. Their story carries deep lessons about human nature and society. It shows how violence thrives where law is weak. It proves that evil often needs nothing more than opportunity. The Harps remind us that civilization is a thin line, and when it breaks, darkness floods in. But the Harps also show the strength of community. In the end, they were stopped not by government or armies, but by ordinary settlers who refused to allow terror to rule their world. It was the courage of neighbors banding together that brought the killers down. Though their crimes occurred more than 2 centuries ago, their story endures. They appear in ballads, in folklore, in ghost stories told in Kentucky and Tennessee. Places still carry their name. Some claim their spirits roam the land, especially near the site of Harp's Head. Historians call them the first American serial killers, but in local memory they are more than that. They are the embodiment of the nightmare lurking in the woods, proof that sometimes the greatest danger is not wolves or hunger, but men themselves. The Harpe Brothers remind us of a truth we would rather forget. Human beings can become predators. They can lose all conscience, all mercy, all humanity. But their story also reminds us that such evil can be confronted and defeated. The Harps died violently, just as they lived. And though they left scars on America's early frontier, they also left a warning that echoes through time. Without justice, without unity, without vigilance, cruelty can flourish. More than 200 years later, their names still send a chill, not because they lived long, but because they revealed how far into darkness men can fall. Before I take you into the disturbing psychology of the Harpe Brothers, I want you to think about this. Do you believe killers are born evil, or does the world create them? Type your answer in the comments, I'll be reading them. And if you're fascinated by the darkest side of history and the twisted minds of true criminals, hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear will connect the past with the present, showing how America's first serial killers still shape the way we understand murder today. The Harpe Brothers lived more than 200 years ago, but their crimes still disturb us because they fit a pattern we now recognize all too well. At the time, people called them monsters, demons, or unnatural men. Today, criminologists and psychologists would use another word: psychopaths. Unlike most outlaws of their era, the Harps were not driven by greed, politics, or revenge. They killed without motive, often laughing at the suffering of their victims. That lack of empathy, that cold pleasure in violence, is the hallmark of what modern psychology calls antisocial personality disorder. If they lived today, the Harps would not be seen as simple criminals. They would be studied as case examples of serial killers. The word serial killer didn't exist in the 1790s. In fact, it wasn't widely used until the 1970s. But the Harps fit the definition perfectly. Multiple murders, committed over a span of time, a pattern of targeting random, often vulnerable victims. Killings driven by psychological gratification, not material gain. This is why historians call them America's first serial killers. They were prototypes of a horror that would repeat itself across centuries, from Jack the Ripper in Victorian London to Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy in modern America. When we compare the Harps to later infamous figures, chilling similarities emerge. Like Ted Bundy, they were manipulative. They lured travelers with offers of help, only to strike. Like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, they spread random terror, making entire communities live in fear. Like Albert Fish, they seemed to gain satisfaction from cruelty itself. But in some ways, the Harps were even worse. Many later killers operated in cities, under the cover of crowds. The Harps operated in the wilderness, where victims had no chance of rescue, no chance of witnesses. Their randomness made them a nightmare for early frontier settlers who already lived on the edge of survival. The frontier as a breeding ground for violence. To understand the Harps, we also have to understand the world that shaped them. The American frontier was violent long before the Harps appeared. Native American tribes fought settlers for their land. Outlaws preyed on wagon trains. Families struggled with hunger, disease, and isolation. The Harps grew up in the chaos of the Revolutionary War, fighting as Tory raiders. As teenagers, they learned to burn, steal, and kill without consequence. That environment may have hardened them, stripping away any sense of morality. But many men experienced that same violence and did not become serial killers. This suggests that the Harps' brutality was not only the product of environment, it was also rooted in who they were. One of the darkest aspects of the Harps' story is the way they seemed to enjoy killing. Multiple accounts describe them laughing during murders. Survivors recalled how they mocked the cries of victims. Big Harp, when confronted about killing his own child, reportedly said it was better dead than crying. This sadistic pleasure in cruelty is what separates them from other frontier killers. They were not eliminating enemies. They were not silencing witnesses. They were entertaining themselves with human suffering. Modern psychology calls this hedonistic killing, a type of murder driven by the enjoyment of the act itself. Another disturbing aspect is the presence of their wives and children. The Harps forced women to live with them, sometimes abducted, sometimes coerced. These women bore their children, cooked their meals, and watched them return from murder sprees. Imagine the trauma of raising children in a camp where blood-stained men laughed about their crimes. Some women tried to escape. Some were beaten. A few may have cooperated out of fear for their lives. Their presence adds another layer to the horror. The Harps weren't loners. They created a twisted version of a family built on violence and fear. When the Harps' crimes became too great to ignore, the frontier responded with extraordinary violence. Posse after posse hunted them. Communities armed themselves. Travelers moved in groups. Big Harp's death in 1799 came at the hands of men who refused to let him escape justice again. They shot him, captured him, and executed him. His severed head was displayed on a pole not just as punishment, but as psychological warfare, a message to others that the frontier would not tolerate such evil. Little Harp's execution in 1804 was equally symbolic. The frontier did not just punish criminals, it destroyed their memory, turning their bodies into warnings. The Harps became more than men, they became symbols. In Kentucky and Tennessee, parents told their children stories of a harp-your-ass head to keep them from wandering at night. Ghost stories claimed their spirits roamed the wilderness. Ballads and folk tales transformed them into demonic figures. Folklore blurred fact and legend, but the effect was lasting. The Harps became shorthand for terror, just as Jack the Ripper would in London decades later. So why do we still tell their story more than 2 centuries later? Because the Harps mark the beginning of America's long, unsettling relationship with serial killers. They remind us that this phenomenon is not modern. It existed in the very birth of the nation. They also remind us of the fragility of order. Where law is weak, where communities are isolated, killers can thrive. Their story is not only about history, it is about the timeless battle between civilization and chaos. Today, criminologists look back on the Harps as a case study. They raise difficult questions. Were they born with damaged minds? Did war and violence shape them into killers? Could they have been stopped earlier if law enforcement was stronger? The answers remain unclear. But their story continues to haunt us because it forces us to confront the reality of human cruelty. The Harpe brothers were not famous outlaws, nor rebels, nor heroes. They were killers who murdered indiscriminately, leaving a trail of death across the frontier. They stand at the beginning of a bloody lineage of serial killers that would follow in American history. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about violence, society, and the human heart. And perhaps that is why we still remember them, not because of who they were, but because of what they reveal about what any person can become when conscience is stripped away. Evil may change its face across centuries, but the Harps remind us that it has always walked beside us.